Farabaugh here. It's Thursday. It's noon. Like we always do on a Thursday at noon, we go live and we talk Penn State football. This edition, this podcast, today's episode, a little different in that it's going to be very NFL focused on the guys who just competed at Pro Day on Wednesday up at Holuba Hall in State College. Me and Nick were both there. Bob Flounders, Joe Hermit, out in Cleveland for the NCAA Wrestling Championships. So those guys are handling that while we handled Pro Day, and we talked to a lot of guys: Drew Allar, Dennis Sutton, Benga Ioane, all the big names for Penn State as they enter the 2026 NFL Draft, which, Nick, is coming up. It is pretty much a month away. April 23rd, I believe, is the first date, right, for the draft in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that is day one.
That is day one. Now, we have a pretty good feeling one Penn State Nittany Lion will hear his name called on day one and a lot more on day two and day three. But first and foremost, Nick, thanks for joining us here today to talk some ball, talk some Nittany Lions heading to the NFL. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Johnny. It is interesting being in a little bit of new territory. Usually this background has black and gold all over it, as you can see by my background. Steelers usually, but it was fun to actually be back to Penn State too. I don't think I've been in Holuba Hall since 2023, and I was only there that year because Joey Porter Jr. was coming out and Steelers connections, obviously. So it was fun actually being back there to cover Penn State Pro Day. It's always a good time. I think it's one of the better run Pro Days actually. I've been to a few of them, so fun.
Yeah, it was a good time. Obviously, catching up with you and catching up with everyone up at Penn State. I'm not up there as much recently because, like, you cover the Steelers. I've been very Eagles focused. Obviously, when a lot went down this past season, and I was still doing columns and providing my perspective on all things Penn State football. But we've got a gear or an eye towards at least you for the Steelers, me for the Eagles. Covering the NFL in the state of Pennsylvania, and these prospects for Penn State could be of interest to both teams, and we will talk about that. But let's start with the biggest name, at Penn State's Pro Day, one of the most polarizing prospects, in this draft overall, not just at his position, but I guess his position, lends itself to be polarizing. It lends itself to opinions. But we're talking about Drew Allar, and we're talking about the guy who came to Penn State as a five-star recruit, as some people viewed him as potential, elevator of the program from that, great to elite, as James Franklin once said. And talking to Drew, yesterday, we talked about remembering being, an 18-year-old kid, just hanging out at Pro Day, watching Sean Clifford throw to Jahan Dotson. And he said that the years go fast, but the days go long. That felt like so long ago, and I remember that vividly. And to see Drew, throwing out there at his own Pro Day, kind of in the middle of this pre-draft process, that his draft stock, like it's very, like, kind of a who knows situation. It's a very up in the air, given the way his last season at Penn State went. Really, it was only half a season with the injury. And he's in a very interesting crop of quarterbacks. You've got Fernando Mendoza from Indiana going number 1 overall to the Raiders. But then after that, it's like, all right, is Ty Simpson a mid-first round guy? Is he a second-round guy? Is he going to fall further? What about Garrett Nussmeier and Carson Beck, and Taylon Green is in the mix there? Like, it's a very interesting group. Allar's a very interesting player. Nick, we'll start with Pro Day specifically and then kind of go from there and just talk more broadly about Drew. What stood out to you yesterday from his Pro Day performance?
Yeah, I thought he was letting it rip a little more than he did at the Combine. He was throwing it, I think, with he showed the velocity off. I thought that was the good thing. A lot of line drive throws. I thought he also, he talked about making it an NFL script, right? Under center play action, showcasing a lot of different routes, layering throws down the field. It was definitely an NFL script. And I think that was more so to showcase what he could do with an NFL offense. And I think that was really smart of him. The fact that he got to throw twice in the pre-draft process is really important for Drew. I think just to remind teams of, hey, the tools are elite. The elite size, the elite arm strength. He still has the movement ability. I thought that kind of showed up. I mean, we're talking about a guy that's 6 to 7 months out of surgery at this point. He's moving well. The mobility is going to be there, I think. So I thought that was something too, showcasing himself moving on the run. I thought he had a decent session. I also thought, there were times where he would spray the ball all over the field. Sometimes throw it behind a guy, maybe a little overthrown at times, but he reminded you of the physical tools. And you're like, I remember this is the 5-star prospect. This is the pedigree of Drew Allar. And I think in this class, John, like being able just to put that back in the minds of scouts, of general managers is very important, because you can easily forget a guy when they're gone that long, when you have that little game tape over the past calendar year. I feel like you can easily go into the back burner, and that can hurt your stock just alone. It is something that hurts your stock. So Drew Allar being able to throw, showcase he's healthy, and really showcase that, hey, this arm, it's something serious. I think it's the best pure tool probably of any of those quarterbacks we talked about in this class. I think that is a very important thing. So I don't think it's going to change any minds, but I think what it does is it serves as a reminder of this is what Drew Allar is, and this is what he could be. If you can get your hands on him, maybe you could be the team to fix him.
Yeah, and Drew throwing yesterday and throwing out at the combine as well in Indianapolis at the Lucas Oil Stadium, like you mentioned, Nick, like throwing twice in this pre-draft process, which, with how his career ended, with how his season ended, with that ankle injury against Northwestern, talking to him out at the combine in Indy, he said that throwing there and throwing at Pro Day was like a really big goal for him, during his rehab process when he was still, with the Penn State team throughout the rest of the regular season. And then when he went out to California to start training and continuing that rehab and kind of that bolstering process, like feeling more confident, feeling better, ramping up to the point where he can throw in front of NFL scouts, coaches, executives. That was a really big deal for him. I thought he looked good out in Indy, letting it rip. And I thought he looked good yesterday at Pro Day, as well. And just a reminder here, this is a live show as it always is on Thursday. So if you've got questions about Drew, if you got questions about any Penn State prospects, toss them in the chat. Nick and I will get to them. But Drew, like throwing was a big deal for him. And just, like you said, reminding people of the skill set that he has. And it's a skill set, like that's why he was a 5-star prospect in the first place. That's why, when I went out to Medina, Ohio, and I talked to his high school coach, Larry Laird, for a story when he was a freshman still backing up Sean Clifford, his high school coach said, like, he's got all the makings of like a Josh Allen. And you think of like how Josh Allen plays and the speed of the ball coming out of his hand, the cannon arm, like he's got those tangibles. It's really always been kind of the intangibles of like decision making that has held him back. I remember sitting down with Drew in between the 2024 and 2025 seasons in that spring, and we discussed at length the Notre Dame game. The interception that ended Penn State's season in the CFP semifinal. He talked so much about learning from that moment, it being a tough watch, but, growing and continuing his development as a quarterback. And then we saw a similar mistake against Oregon in the whiteout. And we don't need to totally rehash this, but like why I bring that up is NFL scouts are going to watch him throw at Pro Day. They saw him throw at Pro Day. They saw him throw at the combine. And there are going to be offensive-minded coaches that can be like, I can work with that raw talent. And then there's going to be other teams that worry about the decision-making, that worry about that tape that's out there, the bad tape, because there's a lot of good. There's a healthy amount of stuff throws you'd like back if you're Drew. And I guess, Nick, where do you kind of like reckon with him as a prospect when you look at those two things? When you on one hand, you see the talent, and then on the other end, you see the kind of mistakes that have held him back from being a first rounder.
Yeah, it's tough because I think the raw tools, as we have talked about, in terms of that crop, I think there's the Mendoza tier, the Simpson tier, and then the rest, right? Out of the rest, he's got the best physical profile of anyone. And I can think of, guys like him that often go in the middle rounds. I don't see him getting past like the 4th round. I don't. I think his range is probably round 3, round 4. I think that's where we're talking about this with him. He could easily be QB3. Like, the idea of 3rd round quarterbacks nowadays is generally fairly rare. We don't really see it. We don't really see a lot of 2nd round quarterbacks. Sometimes we see a late day 2 quarterback, and he could throw into that kind of bucket. But the right sweet spot is probably early day 3, late day 2 for him. And I think that round 4 bucket is, hey, I can get this guy in the building. I can turn him into something that he could be. And then maybe a year or two down the line, you get a position where he could be in spot to maybe win a potential starting job or at least get a shot to do that. I remember, a few guys have gotten into that spot. Jarrett Stidham back in the day was one guy I can really think of that I think actually profiles fairly similar to what Allar had. He had all the pedigree while at Auburn. He was a guy that was all tools. Someone got their hands on was like, let's see what happens. And then he loses to Cam Newton, obviously, in New England for that starting job. But I could see Allar being on a similar track, and maybe it goes differently for him. And so to me, that's largely where I think of Drew Allar is he is in that kind of sweet spot. This is a guy that is absolutely going to get drafted on tools alone. It's not a class with a lot of toolsy quarterbacks. I don't think that a lot of those guys we talked about have great physical traits. So the fact that he does is also going to put him a step above some of them to some teams. He's a frustrating player to watch on tape. He is. The accuracy, the decision-making, some of the pocket management, it's frustrating. But then you have the wow moments. And then you have, the mobility. I think he showcased that yesterday is there. He can still move on the run, throw on the run. He's looking pretty good in his recovery from that. So that'll be part of his game. And then I really think you look at it overall and you just say, he's a polarizing player, but if you can draw out the good from him, you can maybe get a steal here. So I think that round 3, 4, probably more in the 4. Round 4 is probably where he's going to end up going. That's kind of my feeling.
That's where I'm at too. I don't think he will fall past the 4th, but I do think that there is like a chance that he goes in the 2nd. And I say that because this is the NFL. These teams need quarterbacks. They always value quarterbacks high. You talk about him potentially being QB3, and I'm there with you. I think he could. And most years QB3 is like a late first round pick. So in terms, like he won't be a late first round pick. I don't think he will, but I think there is a path. There's an avenue, especially as we now move on from pro days and we go into these, the top 30 pre-draft visits where players are going to, the team facilities and meeting with coaches and breaking things more down. And they're able to get to know prospects better. Like I think Drew will interview well, and I think he already has, out at the combine and has in those opportunities he's had to this point. But I think, when he gets into those pre-draft visits, he'll handle himself really well. And I could see a team or two, again, with like an offensive-minded head coach that maybe has a veteran quarterback already, that might be towards the tail end of his career, and they can look at Drew as a potential successor to a veteran quarterback, bring him in, have like really no pressure to play right away because I don't think he would be ready to play and take over an NFL offense as a rookie. But they can look at that arm, they can look at his experience. You look at a lot of quarterbacks. A lot of these, quarterbacks in this class. I mean, he's got a boatload of experience. He's a 3-year starter. Granted that 3rd year was cut short, but the combination of experience, the combination of being on the big stage and learning and being able to draw on, the mistakes that he's made on the big stage, and even like the really good games he's had on the big stage in that CFP run in 2024. Like, I think that he's a really unique player. He's a really unique prospect. He's a polarizing prospect, and for Penn State fans, he's a polarizing player. He kind of always has been. But I think that's what makes him so intriguing as someone to watch as the draft, is coming down the pike here, in a month. So, yeah.
I'm with you on that, and I think he will interview well. I think that's one thing. I always heard out of this combine was, man, he did a really nice job in the interview room, just pointing out coverages and reading things. I don't think it always translates to the field, but I think he does a great job on the whiteboard and watching tape. He talked about pointing out his own deficiencies, right? That was something he talked about yesterday, was that, teams would ask him what he would fix in his game, and he talked about, footwork, some accuracy stuff. Like, there's things. This is a guy that's, I think, a tough critic on himself, and I think that does play well to the NFL teams. And listen, I cover a team that I think is a prime spot for him. I think the Steelers make a lot of sense for Drew Allar in the 4th round. Like, I really do. Mike McCarthy, Aaron Rodgers is probably going to be in there. There's going to be no pressure for Drew Allar to start there. He can develop alongside Will Howard potentially there. And that could be something that you have. And, there's other teams that I could think about. I think, the Rams are an interesting spot with Matt Stafford, getting a little older. There are some other teams that maybe don't have the old quarterback, but are going to have like a spot quarterback that have an offensive minded guy. The Cardinals, with Brissett there, I think, maybe he could go there with LaFleur. I think I can see, the Packers, they don't have an old quarterback, but they do need to develop a backup at some point. I can see like there's a few different landing spots for him that make a good deal of sense. He really needs to go to one of these offensive gurus that is able to really drag out a lot of the good from him. And I think that's going to be really important for him is if you can get under one of these guys that sees something in you, how do you fix the footwork? Because I think the footwork directly ties in with the accuracy. If you fix the footwork, you probably fix the accuracy. And if you get a guy with the bazooka that's confident throwing over the middle of the field in the intermediate part of the field like Drew is, and he can be accurate, I mean, you can work a lot of things with that. So that's the big step for him if he can make it. I don't think he's ever lacking confidence. I don't think he's ever lacking the ability to kind of wow a room. I think he can be a leader type. I think the intangibles are there from behind the scenes perspective. So I think there's a lot to buy into with Drew Allar.
One more note on the accountability part of this with Drew. He has always been, putting the blame or responsibility on his shoulders after games. I remember after the 2023 game at Ohio State, it was such a big moment for him, his first huge start as a starter. Ohio kid, Ohio State fan growing up, going into the shoe, like the storylines were endless. And Penn State lost, and Drew didn't play particularly well. The entire offense, really didn't play well, and it led to Mike Yurcich being fired ultimately. But Drew, after that game, owned up to everything. He's like, "Look, like I sucked," and everyone's like, "What? Like you're like a 19 or 20-year-old kid, whatever, playing in one of the toughest environments in college football." But he was super hard on himself, and he always has been. And so, an NFL team looking to draft a quarterback, if you like need a guy that intangibly will, not shy from criticism or from putting the responsibility or blame on themselves, Drew is one of those guys. To build off of I agree with, the Steelers obviously could be in a spot. The Rams could be in a spot. The Cardinals, a couple more teams to add to that mix. Drew grew up a huge Browns fan, around Cleveland. And we know it's Shadur. I guess they're going to try the Deshaun Watson experiment again. I don't know if I would if I were them. I think that could be a landing spot, and maybe not a great landing spot for him in terms of just like the organizationally, like the franchise, like, obviously not having a great track record with quarterbacks, but Todd Monken coming in as the head coach, like maybe that's something that, could be appealing. Another one, the Eagles. And I say that because, obviously they have Jalen Hurts kind of, in place as a franchise quarterback. They just traded for Andy Dalton yesterday, but he's on, he's 38 years old. It's a 1-year kind of ride it out backup deal. Tanner McKee could get traded, the Eagles' primary backup. And if he does get traded, Kyle McCord, who they drafted in the 6th round last year, did not pan out, ultimately signed a futures contract with the Packers. So if they trade Tanner McKee, I would not be surprised if the Eagles and Howie Roseman and the quarterback factory that he coined a few years ago, could use a late 3rd or a 4th round pick on a quarterback and view it as like, hey, we're going to develop Allar. We're going to, and at worst, he could be a trade chip like Tanner McKee is now for the Eagles. So just a handful of teams to keep in mind. Again, like a really interesting process for Drew. And we spent a lot of time on him, but look, this is one of the biggest players, the biggest names that has come through Penn State in a while. And a lot has, been attached to him over the last few years. And I know Penn State fans will be interested to see where he goes. And where we go next, Nick, I'll leave to you. Which Penn State prospect do you want to talk about next?
Oh, it's interesting. Since we talked about Venga yesterday, let's go with Venga. Let's talk about Venga Ioane. I think we're talking about a guy there that's where does he go now? I think is the question, because this guy's had a rocket ship attached to him. I feel like this whole process, Johnny, I told you yesterday, I was like, I felt like we talked about him as like a fringe first rounder to start. Now it feels like top 25 is almost a lock. Maybe top 15. I mean, I think he's probably going to be the first interior offensive lineman off the board.
Yeah, I think it's like pretty cut and dry. And as much as Drew Allar might be a polarizing or interesting, kind of prospect, Like Venga very much is not. Very, very much is plug and play. You know what you're going to get with him. You know you're going to get a mauler in the ground game. You know you're going to get a guy who can take on a lot in the pass game, keep a clean pocket, a great head on his shoulders. Like you said, Nick, we were talking about this yesterday after pro day. Yeah, he started this process as kind of a fringe first rounder, as like most top interior offensive linemen do, because it's in terms of the positional value and everything. Those guys tend to get pushed down the first round, and even like late first round guys become early second round guys, etc. I think of like a Cam Jurgens, like, and Landon Dickerson, for the Eagles at least. But Venga's like his stock has just continued to rise because he had such a great combine. Had a really good pro day as well, working out, doing some drills there. And, you look at across the board in terms of mock drafts and you look across and see where he's going in all those. It's like 14 to the Ravens, 17 to the Lions. Like, I'm sure the Steelers at 21 and the Eagles at 23 would love to bring him in their building and make him a part of their organizations, but I don't think he's going to last that long.
No, I really don't. I mean, we're talking about a guy you want to talk about cut and dry. There's not a lot of projection, man. He's got it all. He's got the power. He's got great hand usage. He plays. He could really play wherever, I think, in the interior. He talked about even doing some center work yesterday. I thought that was interesting. I don't think he's necessarily going to be drafted as a center, but I think any team that needs a guard can put this guy in there. And there's a deceivingly a large amount of teams that need a guard. It's a deep guard class, so that could be something that makes Venga last a little longer than maybe you would think. I mean, I don't think he's like getting out of the top 25, but maybe he does go more towards the lower range of that. So I don't want to say that's like a complete impossibility. He's there, 21 for the Steelers, for example, or the Eagles, like both those teams, the Chargers, that 3-team tier right there, just interior line only, interior line. They all three need interior linemen right now, and like that to me is just floor. Honestly, like he doesn't get past the Eagles at 23. I don't think he gets past any of those three teams, and it's just because he's such an easy prospect. I think he's a top 10 talent wise prospect in this class. He had a great pro day yesterday. He looked really good in the drills. I thought he looked awesome in pass pro. I think the footwork looks really good. I think the natural power and jolt you see out of him is impressive through his hips. He is just a squeaky clean player that you could put in a zone scheme, a gap scheme. He's not scheme specific. He's a high character player, very soft spoken, but I think when he speaks, people listen. I think that type of player is what he's going to be at the next level. He plays like a veteran on tape in terms of processing fronts and stunts and things like that. So you're not going to have a hard kind of break-in period. I think he's going to be very good right away. This guy, to me, looks like a decade-long starter and potential Pro Bowler for you for any offensive line. And I mean, I don't know where his range starts. Does it start at 14? I mean, I think, the Ravens at 14 obviously make a lot of sense, but I guess he could go before that, but I think it's probably the start of his range. It feels like 14 through 23 is going to be around where he goes.
Yeah, I don't see a world in which he falls past the Eagles unless they have – a Caden Proctor or a Blake Miller, like a potential long-term Lane Johnson replacement fall into their laps there as well. Like that could make a decision tough. But, Venga Ioane has, told us that he's going to be going on a top 30 visit to the Eagles in the near future. So that's a good sign for him. And yeah, he's just it's such a cool story, honestly, to see all this play out for him. If Penn State fans are unfamiliar, I wrote about this back in August. I had a good conversation with him at Media Day before the 2025 season. And, his journey to Penn State was not linear. It was not clean. He wasn't this like top tier 4-star or 5-star prospect. A spot opened up in Penn State's recruiting class because an offensive lineman flipped from Penn State to Maryland. I'm sure, Penn State fans are like thanking their lucky stars that happened because basically a spot opened up late. Phil Troutwine and at the time the special teams coordinator Stacy Collins, who has a history and some connections out in the Pacific Northwest, and Venga's from Washington State, identified him as a 3-star guy who could come in and get developed and be pretty good. Washington at the time, like he was going to go to Washington, and then their staff had turnover. I think their coach was fired at the time, and the Huskies tried to get it back in on him late, but it was too late. And he was coming to Penn State, and to see him develop and to see him grow and be so good in 2024 and 2025. It's not often that a guard is a standout player, but for Penn State last season, he was their best player on offense. Him and Katron Allen, because Katron was that good too. But to see everything kind of come together for him, and to see the national media and the NFL draft community latch on to him as such a top prospect in this draft, and it's just been really cool to see. And there's a handful of those guys too, like on this Penn State team that was such a big part of the 2024 success, and individually still played well in 2025. Like, I think of Katron Allen, Nick Singleton didn't have a great year last year, but had a great career, and will end up somewhere. Like, I think Nick will end up with a good career in a good landing spot. He might not go into the 5th round, but with the foot injury and everything, who aside from the Drew Allar situation, and then obviously Venga in the 1st round, who do you like as your favorite Penn State prospect aside from maybe Venga, Nick?
Well, I think the next two after that, I think we kind of get into a tier of the next 3 probably, where it probably ends up in Dennis Sutton. I think he's going to be a guy that I think people have totally forgotten about how good Denai was in 2024. I thought he was awesome that year next to Abdul Carter and those guys, and he's a guy that I think can be super productive. Zaki Wheatley, I think, is in that tier. And then I think you do have Katron there. And to me, I think my personal favorite guy to watch is Zaki Wheatley, just because I think he fits like an old mold of Penn State DB. I think he is a guy that is the next wave of this. He plays everywhere. He kind of is a defensive back more than a safety. He can play in the box. He can play in the post. He started a corner before flipping to safety in his career, so he has the ability to play in man-to-man. Like, this is the type of safety prospect you want nowadays in the NFL. You want a guy that can man up, and you want a guy that can still play in the post while also playing in the box, because we see guys like Nick Imanwari and Derwin James and Kyle Hamilton and Brian Branch and all these nickel safety types that can play wherever you want all over the field. Jaquan Brisker is one of those guys, and obviously that is kind of the guy who set the path for Zaki Wheatley. And I think Zaki Wheatley is – I don't know where he's going to go in this draft, because I thought he had an awesome Senior Bowl. That was one thing I think we came out of the Senior Bowl saying, man, Zaki Wheatley was everywhere. I don't think he had a great 40 run yesterday. 4.62 was his best. It's not a great time, but the tape is fun, man. Like, he is everywhere. He's a hammer. He's flying all over the place. He's making plays on the ball. The ball production leaps out of his profile. You look at the ability to make splash plays. And so I think those 3 kind of fit into the next tier. I feel like, you probably see as Sutton in round 3. I think that's probably where he goes. Wheatley round 3, 4. And I think Katron Allen's probably in that same tier. I will say about the running backs, I think we've forgotten how good Katron Allen and Nick Singleton were in 2024. If both those guys come out last year, they're day 2 picks. Singleton might have not gotten out of the 2nd round if he had come out last year as a surprise when he went back. Now he's going to fall further, but that could be a steal of a pick.
Yeah, it's interesting with Nick because, the thing that we were talking about with Drew about, him throwing, it's serving as a reminder to scouts like, hey, this arm talent exists. That's what Nick wanted to do during this pre-draft process, run a phenomenal 40. He was expecting to run in the 4.3s, do all the drills and do it well. And I thought he looked good at the Senior Bowl until he broke that foot. And he's unable to do that. So now, like, you obviously hope it doesn't happen for him, but like, does he kind of fall, further back into the running back pecking order when you look at that position and you've got Jeremiah Love, who's going to go early in the 1st round. And then you got Jadarian Price, also from Notre Dame, probably that running back number 2. And then you've got a group of guys who it's like Katron, like you said, 3rd, 4th. You've got Washington, from Arkansas. You've got Jonah Coleman from Washington. You got Damon Claiborne from Wake Forest. You got a handful of backs, Emmett Johnson from Nebraska. So it's like, does Nick Singleton get lost in the shuffle? And I hope he doesn't, because, like you said, if he left after the 2024 season, he's probably going to be a 2nd round pick or like an early 3rd round pick. Going back to Zaki, like, he talked a lot about out at the combine and even at the Senior Bowl and yesterday at Pro Day about his connection to Joey Porter Jr. and now after the Steelers signed Brisker, like the connections there and the possibility of landing with the Steelers. The Eagles need a safety. Reed Blankenship left in free agency. They drafted Drew Makuba out of Texas in the second round last year, but they could use a rookie to pair with kind of a low cost veteran. I don't see them spending big at the position after they didn't, bring back Blankenship or sign Brisker. So I could see Zaki staying in state at either the Eagles or the Steelers. Nick.
Yeah, I could see him fitting in there. Listen, the Steelers need a safety. They want a versatile safety, though. It's a crowded room right now with, Brisker, Deshaun Elliott, and Darnell Savage, and then Jalen Ramsey kind of being the guy that moves around. But they have a big future need there. Zaki Wheatley would fit that perfectly. There's just a lot of safety needy teams in this class. It's a very good safety class, but I think Zaki still makes himself kind of stand out with how versatile he is. A mid-round option like that, I think he'll be a great special teamer too. I think that's something that I thought, Zaki Wheatley's tape showed he has a nose for the ball. And so, he's the type of guy that's like always in the right place at the right time. And there's instincts to that. There's awareness. And I think that also really translates to special teams. So that's a guy that I think you get utility out of, even if he sits for a year before he starts, potentially in year two. That's the type of guy you want in draft because you're going to get day one impact from him, at least in the third phase of the game. And so Wheatley to me is the type of guy that you look at, and I mean, I'm not sure he gets out of round three. I really don't. I think there's maybe a chance just because of how deep the safety class is. But I also think his versatility is going to push him up for some team that runs a lot of sub-package football. And, I think the Steelers are going to be in that tier with Patrick Graham and stuff like that. But there's a lot of other teams I can think of that he would fit in very well with. I think he could fit well in Brian Flores' defense, for example. That's a fit I could see. Mike Vrabel, I think his defense, he could be very good in New England. New Orleans, I think he makes a good deal of sense. Like there's guys that he fits in those spots, I think, really well, and those are safety needy teams. So I think he's done a really nice job of boosting his stock here over these past 2 to 3 months and kind of making himself known as another guy that I feel like had a really good 2024. I thought Zaki Wheatley had a good 2025, but just kind of, again, reminding them of that pedigree of, hey, Zaki Wheatley's pretty good. And another guy that, hey, if he had come out in 2024, it probably isn't, again, a day 2 pick, I think, probably.
Yeah, and another guy who had a phenomenal 2024. When I think of Zaki Wheatley, I think of first of all, I think of him making like an early play. I forget if he forced the fumble or landed on the fumble at Auburn early in his career. It was like him and Jalen Reed. It was like, oh, these two young safeties are making plays. And then, I think what was probably his best performance or what people remember most was the 16 tackles against Notre Dame in the CFP semifinal. Like he was everywhere. But who else was everywhere was Dennis Sutton. And Denai at that point, if he had left after that game, there's a chance he would have been a late first round, early second round pick. And now it's at a point where he's in this edge rusher group where it's really deep. Like it's really deep. We know that Arvell Reese, David Bailey, you look at like Keldrick Falk and Ruben Bain, like those guys are first rounders. Even Cassius Howell might be like a late first rounder. And then you get into the second round, you got like Zion Young and there's just a laundry list of names. Like, the Athletics Dane Brugler ranked his top 100 prospects and had Denai at number 68. And he was the number 12 edge rusher. That just kind of shows how deep, the class is. But I think at the combine, logging the relative athletic score that he did, it was just like kind of off the freaking charts. His 40-yard dash time was incredible. We always knew that he was a freaky athlete at 6'5", 255. The production is there, the mentality is there, the leadership is there. Playing in that Pinstripe Bowl game, having the performance that he did to close out his Penn State career. And I see him as a guy who could very easily go in the second round and make a team really happy. Like he might not be like a true game wrecking, standout all pro defensive end in the NFL and have that kind of future, but he's going to have a long career. Like he's the kind of guy that you look at and you're like, okay, I can see him having a 10-year career in this league just because of how good and solid he is in so many different facets.
he is, a guy that I think is maybe where do you want him to play at weight wise too? Do you want to play more at like 265 than maybe up a little more? Just because I think he has such strong hands. If he can just add like the tick of burst on tape, we could be talking about like a really dynamic speeder because I think he has bend. I think he has a lot of really great traits for a guy like him. And so to me, he's a guy that probably doesn't get out of the third round. He could go early third. Like that could 100% be a thing. You mentioned, how many different players there are. There are also a lot of guys that are just pass rusher only. When you watch Denai, I don't feel like you get that label with him. He's always been a pretty good run defender. I think that's one thing that he's a more complete profile of edge in this class. There's only a few guys after the first round. And even in the first round, I think of guys like Keldrick Folk. He's all run defense, not a lot of, pass rush. I think of Cassius Howe. He's the opposite of that. Denai, I think, is the type of guy that kind of is strong at both. And I think he's the guy, we could look back, on Denai a year from now and say, well, if you do the redrafts now, he's going in the first round. Like, that's the type of guy I feel like Denai Dennis Sutton is. He's a good player. He is, I think, flying under the radar right now. But, I easily could be a top 75 pick, and rightfully so. He has all the traits to do it. Had a great combine, as you mentioned, and the tape is very, very good. And the production has always been there, too. If you're a stat sheet looking person, he has all the stats that you would want out of a good, productive edge rusher at the next level. There's just not a ton to ding on Denai's tape or on his profile. So we're not talking, super as squeaky clean as a guy like Venga was, but we're talking about a guy that I don't think, again, has like a ton of projection. I think you kind of know he's a very high floor prospect to me. And I think you just kind of know you're kind of going to get, at the very least, a really good rotational player at the next level.
Absolutely. And, talking to Denai at Pro Bowl, at Pro Bowl, maybe in the Pro Bowl in his future, at Pro Day, he said that he has a visit lined up with the Baltimore Ravens. That seems like a cultural fit, and he's from the area as well. He's from Lower Delaware. Went to the McDonough School in Maryland in high school and became a top prospect from there. He also has a top 30 visit lined up with the Eagles, and the Eagles have been really interested in him throughout the entire process. They talked to him. Clint Hurt, the defensive line coach for the Eagles, was the head coach of his team at the Senior Bowl. They talked a lot down there. The Eagles talked to him at the Combine. Now they have a top 30 with him lined up. And the Eagles feel like kind of a perfect spot for him to slide into, whether that's, at number 68, in the third round, maybe even earlier, 54, I believe the Eagles pick in the second round, if they just really want to get him and round out their edge rusher group. Because you look at what the Eagles have, it's like Jalen Hunt, who is a pass rush first guy. Nolan Smith is more of a run defense first guy. They just signed Arnold Ebiketie, former Penn State and Temple guy from the Falcons, as kind of a rotational piece. But they lost Jalen Phillips to a massive contract in free agency. And I think of like what made Jalen Phillips so good for the Eagles last season. He didn't, like, the sack total wasn't insane, but how dependable he was in Vic Fangio's system of like defending the edge on the run, creating opportunities for others in the pass game, in terms of drawing attention and creating havoc that forced sacks into other people's laps. Basically, that's what Denai did at Penn State. Zane Durant and even Abdul Carter in 2024 at times ate because Denai was so much of a handful off the edge. And so if he lands with the Eagles, I wouldn't be surprised. If he lands elsewhere, obviously, I think he has a bright future ahead of him as well, Nick. All right, so we're approaching like 40 minutes here. We've talked about the big names. Any day three prospect for the Eagles, or for Penn State, a guy who could latch on in fifth, sixth, anyone we haven't talked about, kind of catch your eye.
Well, I do think Zane Durant is a guy that maybe we haven't mentioned, but is a very athletic interior defensive lineman. Teams are gonna, get a pass rush first type of guy are probably gonna latch on to him a little bit in that round 5 or 6 area. I think. I'm interested to kind of see what happens with Khalil Dinkins. He's somebody that, the stats aren't popping off the page, but he's always been kind of a dirty worker. He's a good blocker. He's a versatile player. He's played H-back. He's played out wide. He's played with his hand in the dirt. there's not many H-back types in this class. He kind of is one. It's a very deep tight end group, but he to me is a guy that can make a roster and spend much longer on an NFL team and in the NFL than maybe you would think. And he's somebody that I'd keep an eye on that could at least maybe do something here. And then this is just a guy like he's probably not going to get drafted, but I think he as a UDFA he could really make a push. Certainly at least make a practice squad. I've always been a fan of Trevor Pena. I've liked this guy since he's gone back to his days at Syracuse. But he catches everything. I think that's the thing. He catches everything, tough as nails. I think he's obviously going to be a little bit on the smaller side, but he's a guy that I think could surprise some people. So that's the other name I wanted to point out to you. For you, I mean, Drew Shelton might be someone to keep an eye on as well. He's a guy that could, be a guy that maybe goes. I think he honestly could go as early as the 4th round, but I don't know if he'll go that early.
Yeah, that's what I was about to talk about, Drew Shelton. And the list of guys, so I mentioned already, Venga, Deny, Drew Shelton as well as a visit lined up with the Eagles. And he's from Downingtown, was a star of Downingtown West, so that's going to count as a local visit, not against the 30 prospects that you can bring in for almost like official visits for, in college terms during this pre-draft process. But he'll be visiting the Eagles, and I'm sure that other teams will be interested in him, as well. Given how athletic he is, the experience he has as a 2-year starter at left tackle, I thought he held up well. He was kind of always solid. He was never, taking over for Olu Fashanu. He obviously isn't that level of a prospect, but for a guy who got thrown in the fire when Olu got hurt, as a true freshman, Drew Shelton held his own, and I think he continued to do that throughout his Penn State career. When you're looking at the Eagles specifically, like if they don't land that Blake Miller or Caden Proctor in the 1st round, and you're just continuing to address other needs, like Drew Shelton could be a developmental guy in the 4th, maybe even like the late 3rd, as a potential replacement for Lane Johnson, or just to add to your offensive line room. I think whichever team ultimately ends up with Drew Shelton, will be pretty happy. And Max and I, last week talked a little bit about like the run of late round offensive linemen that Penn State have had over the last handful of years that have turned out pretty well, in the NFL. You look at Will Fries, with the Vikings. You look at Rasheed Walker, doing a job as a 7th rounder, becoming a starter for the Packers, and now signing a contract in free agency. Ryan Bates. So there's a history there, right, of these guys with really good athletic profiles, but like not quite the 1st, 2nd, 3rd rounder. That I think Drew Shelton kind of falls into that bucket and will probably make a team really happy.
I agree. That has always been Penn State's MO, is like they produce linemen, man, really on both sides of the ball. They end up producing linemen that kind of are able to stick. It doesn't matter if they're the 6th or 7th round. These guys are generally better on tape and generally better profile-wise than you would think. And so Drew Shelton, to me, fits into that tier. He's definitely a guy I think that has swing tackle potential at the very least, as a depth option. But we've seen, as you mentioned, I think Will Fries is the best example of that, where he comes out of nowhere. I mean, he landed a massive contract from the Colts, and it's kind of become a foundational piece for them. So I think Shelton fits into that. He's a really easy mover in space, too. I think that will make him less scheme dependent. So there are going to be teams that really like him regardless of his athletic profile, regardless of his size. But he's really able to kind of get out in space and work on those zone runs and work in gap schemes too. So I think he'll be a guy that probably ends up in the 4th or the 5th. That's probably the right spot for him, but could push up, as you mentioned, into that 3rd round.
Yeah, and then just one guy before we round this up and wrap it up. I talked a good bit about Nick. I feel like we talked or addressed Katron, but we didn't really dive too deep into him. I don't like. Kind of on the Venga front and on the Deny front, like he's kind of plug and play. He is what he is, and he's a damn good football player. The vision has always been there, but it's even grown over the years. You look at the power and just his feel, for open space, and the patience that he has as a runner. We look at like this draft class, and it's a lot of guys who could have left after the 2024 season, and some of their stocks have dipped since then. I think Katron only improved his by coming back and playing the way he played last season. And obviously, like, the accolades are great, right? Becoming Penn State's all-time leading rusher. But you just kind of flip on the tape and you know that he's going to provide, some serious power. And whether that's as a starter, whether that's as a RB2, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Like, I think he would fit perfectly. I know that they just signed Pacheco, but I think he would fit perfectly in Detroit, alongside of Jahmyr Gibbs, as a long-term, replacement for David Montgomery. But there are a lot of teams that could use a Katron Allen. Penn State certainly used them and used them really well down the stretch last season. And he's got a bright future as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of teams I think he could fit with. The Packers, I think, might make some sense there as a compliment to Josh Jacobs. I think that's a natural fit. I think that, honestly, Katron, I know he doesn't necessarily – I don't know about their interest in him, but the Ravens feel like a fit to him for me. Derrick Henry's only getting a little older. They, I think, need some depth. Keaton Mitchell's gone now from there, and he could be a fit there. But Katron is just a really tough, rugged runner that runs behind his pads. He's hard to bring down. He's got great contact balance. He's going to be the type of player, as you mentioned, really not a hard projection. Like, he is easy to kind of look at and say, I know what he is. The other team that I think actually makes a lot of sense is the Houston Texans. I think that's a team that could make some sense. I know they have, Woody Marks down there, and he had a really good rookie year. But he could be kind of a power complement to what Woody Marks does. So that there's a lot of teams I think that Katron fits in. I can name about half the league I think he'd look good in, just in terms of their situations and what he could bring to the table. To me, a guy that could easily be a top 5 running back off the board in this class. It's not a great running back class, and he kind of stands out as a guy that's had workhorse ability, and has been a guy that has been a dynamic rusher on a really good team in 2024.
Awesome. Nick, before we wrap this up, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second. I'll kind of do it to myself too with the Eagles. But if there is one Penn State player that you think, if you had to put your eggs into the basket of one Penn State player that the Steelers will draft in April, who would it be?
Probably Drew Allar. I think that's probably the one that would make the most sense. They're going to draft a quarterback at some point, and I think tools wise he makes the most sense. He's also in the right spot, I think, for them. Probably the 4th round. I think it'd be either him, Nussmeier, or Beck. So that'd probably be the one guy I'd put. Be either him or Zaki Wheatley. I think it's one of those two.
Gotcha. No, I like it. I think it makes sense. And again, even if they bring back Rodgers too for another year, you let Drew learn for a season. I think that'd be a solid situation for him to land in if that's the case. For the Eagles. I was talking a lot about how Denai has generated so much interest from them. So he would be my obvious pick, I think. But Nick Singleton would be one that I would keep an eye on, because you look at the Eagles running back room, obviously they have Saquon, and Saquon's not going anywhere. But Tank Bigsby's contract is up at the end of the 2026 season. Will Shipley's contract is up at the end of the 2027 season. If Tank Bigsby, plays as well as he did last season in spots, he could land an actual multi-year contract elsewhere. And then Will Shipley just hasn't really done much with the opportunities that he's had. And he's also the Eagles kickoff returner. And we've seen them, NFL teams across the board put running backs back there because of the new dynamic kickoff. And I could see Nick slotting in well as a kick returner, as a guy that, maybe Sean Mannion, new offensive coordinator, could use in space and just get him the ball, and as a change of pace, 3rd down back. So that's one to keep an eye on. But yeah, Drew for the Steelers, Denai for the Eagles, being the most obvious fits there, makes a whole lot of sense.
And then Venga for either.
Yeah, Venga for any team that could use some interior help. Venga.
I literally did not say Venga just because I don't think he's going to be there. But if he is at 21, I have a hard time seeing them pass up on him.
And same deal at 23. I just think, knowing, again, obviously how good he is, and then his mentality, and knowing how well that I'm sure he's impressing all these teams in interviews and everything. I just really find it hard. One, I find it hard for him to fall to 21 or 23. And then also just and again, like this is not a knock on him, but more of just the positional value thing. I don't see either team like trading up for an interior offensive lineman. Typically, you would do that for a tackle or a quarterback or whatever, maybe. But yeah, I think Venga will hear his name called before either the Steelers or the Eagles come on the clock. But he's going to make a team really happy. Nick, thanks so much for joining me, man. This was a lot of fun. Hope everyone out there enjoyed this as well. You know, we'll have more NFL draft talk, obviously, as it approaches, and you know where these Nittany Lions may or may not go. Very intrigued to see it all play out. But Nick, thanks for joining me, and thanks for everyone for listening.